Gary Nash, Professor Emeritus of History from the University of California, Los Angeles, stands among America's finest historians. He will be speaking on African Americans in the Age of Revolution for this lecture series. Today his topic is the Black Americans' Revolution. Tomorrow he will be speaking on Rethinking the Unthinkable. Could the Founding Fathers have abolished slavery? And on Wednesday, November 10th, he will speak on the subject Race, Citizenship, and National Identity in the Early Republic. I'm Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and I'm a professor of history and African American studies. I'm also bringing greetings from the chair of our department, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who is unfortunately in Paris. But he wanted very much to have been here, and so I do convey his spirit to you. I can think of no one more representative of the spirit of Nathan Huggins, the man for whom this lecture series is named, than Gary Nash. In this annual memorial lecture, we remember Nathan Huggins not only for his great leadership as the Director of Afro-American Studies, as our department was then called, and the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, but we remember Professor Huggins' scholarship and his contribution to transforming the story of America from a history of white men, of generals and elected office holders, to a story rich in racial, ethnic, class, and gender diversity. Nathan Huggins devoted his intellectual energy to the integration of African American history into the larger study of American history. So too has Gary Nash. Through his numerous books and articles, through his decade-long leadership of the National Center for History in the schools, through his presidency of the Organization of American History, and in many other capacities as scholar and activist, Gary Nash has never failed to bear witness to the history of African Americans and to the diversity of this country. Professor Nash studied at Princeton University, where he received both his bachelor's degree and his doctorate. He has enjoyed a long and distinguished teaching and administrative career at UCLA, beginning in 1966. In addition to being professor of history, he served as the Dean of Undergraduate and Inter-College Curricular Development and the Dean of the Council on Educational Development. He is the author of many books. I will name only a few. Quakers and Politics, Pennsylvania, 1681 to 1726, was published in 1968 and was awarded the prize of Best Book in American History by the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. In 1979, Gary Nash published The Urban Crucible, Social Change, Political Consciousness, and the Origins of the American Revolution, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History and winner of the Commonwealth Club of California's Silver Prize in Literature. His book, Forging Freedom, The Formation of Philadelphia's Black Community, 1720 to 1840, was published in 1988, and it was one of my favorites. It won the prize of Best Book from the Society for the History of the Early American Republic. Professor Nash is one of the early scholars to deal with the colonial encounter with African Americans, Europeans, and Indians. His pioneering book, Red, White, and Black, The Peoples of Early America, published in 1974, was also published in Spanish. His latest book is called African American Lives. It is a title that also Professor Gates and I have for our book, but his book is a textbook on African American history, the struggle for freedom. Our book is a compilation of biographies. Director of the National Center for History in the Schools, Professor Nash oversees publication of over 60 teaching units on specific issues and events in the U.S. and world. Today, he works closely with middle school and high school teachers, and through his organization, the breadth of the American people and their contribution to world history is emphasized. Today, he's working with teachers and designing a curriculum for students in grades 5, or rather from grades 5 through the 12th grade, middle school through secondary school. The National Center for History in the schools recommends, for example, the study of the civil rights movement. And to show you the breadth of Gary Nash and his understanding of American culture in such an expansive way, he's also co-authored a curriculum on Jazz in the Classroom series for 5th, 8th, and 11th graders, produced by the Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz. I must say, I'd love to take that class. Professor Nash received probably the most controversial attention in his role as the co-chair of the National History Standards Project between the years of 1992 and 96. He has been a regular target of Lynn Cheney, the wife of Vice President Dick Cheney, and he's quite proud of it because of his efforts to speak not only about the good in America, but also about the injustice of America. He has been criticized. But there are many of us who see him beyond that type of criticism, and we are privileged to have him today as our scholar. We are privileged to know him and to know of the tradition with which he writes. He writes in the tradition of Carter Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, and Nathan Huggins. So certainly for me and for my colleagues in African American history, Gary Nash, you are a hero. We are truly honored to have you speak to us over the next 3 days. Thank you.
Well, I do deeply appreciate those kind words and the invitation to come here to the Du Bois Institute. This is a very, very special moment in my career as a historian. I would feel a little more comfortable if it was W.B. Du Bois looking over my shoulder, but I'm a little afraid of this man here. I almost expect he'll come to life and descend on me when I say things that he would not have liked or agreed with. But I've got to say my piece nonetheless. And if I stumble, it's because of my nervousness. In the centuries-long history of African Americans, it almost goes without saying that the struggle for freedom and equality has been central to the black experience. It is the hope of gaining freedom in a land of captivity and wresting equality from a society whose founding documents guarantee it that has kept harrowed bodies and weary souls going. In this struggle, the American Revolution had enormous importance. It marked the first mass slave rebellion in American history. It initiated the first civil rights movement, produced the first reconstruction of black life. It brought forth the first written testimonies from Africans in America who wanted the world to hear of their strivings and their freedom claims. And it involved the first budding of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth. It has taken nearly 2 centuries for school children and the public to begin learning about the African American revolutionary experience, a corrective to historical amnesia that is far from complete today. Not that a handful of historians didn't try. Boston's William C. Nell was the first, and we should honor his efforts in the 1850s as the first historian of black revolutionary service. It was at age 35 that he published a pamphlet, Colored Americans in the Wars of 1776 and 1812, soon expanded into a fuller, Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. It was a book that came out with endorsements from Harry Beecher Stowe and Boston's Wendell Phillips, who hoped that the book would, quote, redeem the character of the Negro race and, quote, stem the tide of prejudice against the colored race. And it was a book that reached the public, the second fuller book, in 1855, just as newspapers were reporting fearsome violence over abolitionism in Bleeding, Kansas. Nell never hid the cards he was trying to play. He was intent on showing that black men had shed their blood as freely as whites in the Revolution, and he told dramatic stories about black heroism and sacrifice. This was an unbalanced account of the African Americans' revolution because it entirely ignored the huge number of men and women, mostly enslaved, who fled to and fought alongside the British in order to gain the freedom. This silence is understandable when we think back to the 1850s. Given the rabid Negrophobia in the North confronting abolitionists, as long as the rock-ribbed defense of slavery in the South. We can imagine how Nell must have stood here in Boston and concluded that to publicize the belief among most slaves that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were best pursued with the British would only cripple the abolitionists' cause. For many decades, it was a dirty secret that the black freedom quest was mostly tied to fighting with the British, the side in the War for Independence that offered freedom. And this remained only in the memories of Revolutionary War black descendants. Not until 1922 did Carter G. Woodson, the second African American to receive a doctorate in history after Du Bois, dared to include a paragraph in his The Negro in Our History about the thousands of South Carolina and Georgia slaves who fled to the British. But Woodson stepped gingerly too. In his account, African Americans in the Revolution, whether enslaved or free, were mostly valorous, patriotic Americans. Perhaps it mattered little one way or another, because public schools and college students and the public in general learned almost nothing in those days about the African American revolutionary experience from the books that commanded the library shelves. The multi-volume 19th century histories of the United States by George Bancroft, Richard Hildreth, Edward Channing, and Henry Adams, down to 20th century textbook school book historians such as Charles and Mary Beard, David Muzzy, and others. The record is so paltry on black history in general in these books that it would appear that the British and Americans fought for 7 years as if 500,000 African Americans had been magically whisked off the continent. For any historian who bothered to mention people of African descent, such as Harvard's John Fiske, a few sentences sufficed. Quote, "The relations between master and slave in Virginia were so pleasant that the offer of freedom from the British fell upon dull, uninterested ears. With light work and generous fare, the condition of the Virginia Negro was a happy one. He was proud of his connection with his master's estate and family, and had nothing to gain by rebellion." Only in 1940 would a slim pamphlet set the stage for turning upside down the historical understanding of the black revolutionary experience. It came in a slim pamphlet entitled The Negro in the American Revolution by Herbert Abthecker, a man steeled by the American Communist Party's recruitment and defense of black Americans. Abthecker began with the pragmatic notion that the revolution offered black people, mostly enslaved, options never before available in their quest for freedom. He did not ignore black service in the American Army and Navy. In fact, he provided for the first time an estimate of about 5,000 such men. But against that number, Abthecker reckoned some 100,000 African Americans who fled their masters to join the British after Lord Dunmore, Virginia's royal governor, issued his earth-shaking proclamation in late 1775 offering freedom for any slave or indentured servant who joined the British with a willingness to fight against the treasonous Americans. The cat was now out of the bag. Massive defection from slavery among a people pictured by white historians as docile and contented. The African American people, wrote Abthaker, played what at first glance appears to have been a dual role from 1775 to 83. Service with the American forces when they were permitted to do so, on the one hand, and wholesale flight to the British in search of freedom, on the other hand. These, in his words, varied and superficially contradictory activities had one common origin, one set purpose: the achievement of liberty. As in every epoch of African American history, he reasoned, again his words, the desire for freedom is the central theme, the motivating force, unquote. And then in 1961, Benjamin Quarles employed Abthaker's new conceptual framework to produce his classic, The Negro in the American Revolution. In the book's first paragraph, he explained, quote, the Negro's role in the Revolution can best be understood by realizing that the major loyalty was not to a place nor to a people, but to a principle. Insofar as he had freedom of choice, he was likely to join the side that made him the quickest and the best offer in terms of those unalienable rights of which Mr. Jefferson spoke, unquote. A sprawling scholarship since 1961, when that book appeared, recorded in the many pages of the Harvard Guide to African American History, produced here at the Du Bois Institute, proceeds from Quarles' remarkable achievement. And how far now the wheel of history has turned. Let me look this afternoon at the varieties of black revolutionary experience, with vignettes of individuals who can stand for much larger numbers of men and women. First, Barzillai Lew, a strong man with a great musical talent, and he was free. He was born in Groton, Massachusetts. He grew up in Dracut. He had served at age 17 in the 7 Years' War in 1760, and 3 weeks after the firefights at Concord and Lexington in April 1775, he enlisted in the Massachusetts 27th Regiment, a unit formed in Chelmsford, where he now lived at that time with his wife and 4 children, the youngest of them born 10 days after the shot heard round the world at Concord Bridge. Lew was one of some 150 African Americans who fought at Bunker Hill, making up about 5% of the Patriots there, which is to say they were twice as numerous there as proportionately they were in the Massachusetts population. He re-enlisted to march a month later to Fort Ticonderoga, where he served under Benedict Arnold. He re-enlisted a 3rd time in late 1777. After the war, father of 13 children, he lived to age 78, dying in 1822. Lew embodied what we can call the spirit of 76, as it was called then. That is, trying to enlist under the white revolutionary glorious cause, as it was called. White men of his age and family responsibilities enlisted in large numbers in the early days of the war, but few enlisted twice more, as did Lew. At the Battle of Bunker Hill and later in the Battle of Rhode Island, black soldiers from the northern states served in twice the proportion of their number in the population. The best estimates of their service indicates that overall they responded to the call to arms more readily than white men, that is, free African Americans at the time, which would be a very small percentage of those who were black. One reason for this was that after the first flush of patriotism, the revolution turned into a poor man's war. And since most black New Englanders were poor, they became targets for recruiting sergeants and also people who saw a chance to move forward. Also relevant was that some black men enlisted to gain their freedom to serve the cause of independence in place of their master. Peter Salem of Framingham, Massachusetts, is a good example. He was the man who fired the shot that killed the British Major John Pitcairn at Bunker's Hill and signed up with his master's pledge of gaining his freedom. History buffs can find Peter Salem portrayed today by a National Park Service ranger at Minuteman National Historic Park. Peter Salem's story was that of thousands of African Americans and white indentured servants in the North who gambled that they would survive their enlistment and enter civilian life as free men. They were mostly young. They were embarked on a double quest for freedom, America's freedom and their personal independence. A Hessian officer fighting for the British observed in 1777, quote, "The Negro can take the field instead of his master, and therefore no regiment is seen in which there are not Negroes in abundance, and among them are able-bodied, strong, and brave fellows," unquote. Early in the war, black Americans soon had to fight for the right to fight. New Englanders at first were glad to have men of color fighting alongside them or in place of them. It needs to be remembered that this would be the last war with integrated troops until the Korean War of the 1950s. But pressure from white Southern leaders very quickly led Washington to purge his army of African Americans with a general order on November 12, 1775. I'm not wrong about the date. November 1775, that is to say 8 months before the Declaration of Independence. Ironically, November 12th, observe the timing, ironically just 5 days after Virginia's royal governor offered freedom to slaves reaching his British encampment. Within 6 weeks, Washington partially reversed his order. With congressional approval, he reopened the Continental Army to free black men, but now not to slaves. In the Valley Forge winter of 1777-78, Washington further amended his recruitment policy. Struggling to regroup his manpower-starved army, he accepted a proposal to raise a regiment of slaves from Rhode Island. The state's legislature used lofty language to endorse the idea. Quote, "History affords us frequent precedents of the wisest, the freest, and bravest nations having liberated their slaves and enlisted them as soldiers to fight in defense of their country," unquote. On the ground, the motives were less lofty. Historian Lorenzo Green is surely right in arguing that the proposal was, in his words, inspired by stark necessity, unquote. Like other states, by the third year, almost the fourth year of the war, Rhode Island by this time was reaching for the bottom of the social barrel to recruit poor black white men for regiments thinned by disease, absenteeism, and outright desertion. White Rhode Islanders now rebuilt what some called their, quote, "ragged, lousy, naked regiment," with slaves liberated by their masters, who were promised, the masters promised compensation from the public coffers for their loss of labor. Fighting in American regiments offered one avenue then, out of a lifetime in slavery. But this was a case-by-case struggle for black freedom. A much smaller number of black Northerners understood that they might use the war as a lever to end slavery altogether. Never before in the history of North American enslavement have they held at their disposal the words of white colonists, words that could be potent weapons in the black fight for freedom. White defenses of natural rights in protest against English policies, and street and tavern talk about the immutable laws of nature and the legitimacy of defying tyranny was like so much cognitive shrapnel exploding in the kitchens, stables, barns, fields, and docksides where slaves toiled. The more such rhetoric entered public discourse, the more enslaved Africans saw an opportunity to expose the glaring contradiction of freedom-loving white patriots embracing black slavery. Indeed, by the mid-1760s, with white leaders saying as much, the idea of birthright freedom lodged unmistakably in black minds. Take Boston, for example. Here, enslaved Africans in America could hardly have overlooked James Otis's frontal assault on slavery in 1764, where he asserted, quote, "The colonists are by the laws of nature free-born, as indeed all men are, white or black. Does it follow that 'tis right to enslave a man because he is black? Will short curled hair instead of Christian hair, as 'tis called by those whose hearts are as hard as the nether millstone, help the argument? Can any logical inference in favor of slavery be drawn from a flat nose, a long or a short face?" Unquote. In Virginia, slaves could hardly have missed the assertion of Arthur Lee, published in the most widely read newspaper in the southern colonies just a year later, in 1765, that, quote, "Freedom is unquestionably the birthright of all mankind, of Africans as well as Europeans, and that slavery, quote, is in violation of justice and religion," unquote. Boston's town meeting pushed for a law in response to attacks of this sort to ban further slave importation and slave sales. And by 1773, Harvard honors students were devoting the commencement debate to the question of the morality and legality of slavery. We can only imagine how word of mounting indictments of slavery must have seemed to tens of thousands of enslaved Africans that perpetually dark clouds had opened to allow bright rays of sun to shine. But should they wait for white legislators or individual slave owners to end their travails? Most were leaderless and isolated, unable to do more than hope and wait. But some rose and pursued two strategies: either to sue their master individually to gain freedom, or petition legislatures to abolish slavery altogether. Jenny Slew of Salem, Massachusetts, was one of the former. Plucking up her courage, she went to a local court with an appeal to restore what she claimed was her birthright freedom. John Adams witnessed the court case and told his diary that Jenny Slew won her case and that he had, quote, "heard there have been many such cases in Massachusetts." Freedom suits for freedom at court now multiplied in the small country towns dotting the New England landscape, where non-slaveholders composed most juries. But in Boston, where many jurors did own slaves, the better strategy then was for slaves to petition the legislature for a general emancipation. This happened 3.5 years before the Declaration of Independence. In the first week of 1773, many slaves living in the town of Boston, as they announced, and other towns in the province, this is the words of the petition, submitted what historians so far have found as the first petition asking for a general release from bondage. The slaves had taken a page from the Patriot's Book of Tactics, organizing themselves, so to speak, as one from many towns, a kind of informal committee of correspondence. The petition sorrowfully related that slaves, quote, "who have had every day of their lives embittered with this most intolerable reflection, that let their behavior be what it will, nor their children to all generations shall ever be able to do or to possess and enjoy anything, no, not even life itself, but in the manner as the beasts that perish," unquote. The black protest assumed the character of a broadside, to be nailed to tavern doors and lampposts and other public places in Boston, when an anonymous friend of the slaves published the petition as a small pamphlet just a few weeks later, with 2 letters appended, one by, quote, "a lover of true liberty," the other by the Sons of Africa. The petition did not succeed, but neither was it a failure, for it spurred a debate in the legislature over abolishing slavery. 3 months later, again borrowing from the White Patriot Strategy book, 4 black men published a hard-hitting leaflet where they spoke for our fellow slaves in this province. They began tauntingly, We expect great things from men who have made such a noble stand against the designs of their fellow men to enslave them, meaning the British attempts to figuratively enslave the Americans. The petition went on with a passage, a remarkable passage, that showed how word of the Spanish practice of coartación, the legal right of Spanish slaves to buy their way out of slavery, the legal right, how this had spread all the way to New England. Quote, even the Spaniards, who have not those sublime ideas of freedom that English men have, are conscious that they have no right to all the services of their fellow men. We mean the Africans. Therefore, they allow the Africans 1 day a week to work for themselves, to enable them to earn money to purchase the residue of their time, which they have a right to demand in such portions as they are able to pay for. Disappointed in legislative inaction on the issue of slavery, black activists tried again in 1774 with still more strenuous language. Quote, a great number of blacks of the province held in a state of slavery within the bowels of a free and Christian country have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms, as we are a free-born people and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatsoever, unquote. This time the legislature partly answered the petition by passing a law banning further importation of slaves, only to have Governor Thomas Hutchison, whose friends included slave importers, veto it. Yet black petitioners made slavery a major topic of discussion, bringing thousands of the slaves to a state of anticipation. Freedom suits and petitions finally paid off in Massachusetts, but it would take several years of war. And this time, at the hands of a woman who was all humbleness on the surface, but iron underneath. Mum Bet grew up enslaved in Sheffield, Massachusetts, a western town, as you know, where she heard her share of the white townsmen's rhetoric in their struggle against British oppression. Her owner fought briefly in the war, and her own husband fell on a Massachusetts battlefield. She may have followed the heated debates over writing a constitution for Massachusetts beginning in 1776, and how many towns wanted the abolition of slavery written into the state's constitution. But the war wore on, and the Constitution was belatedly passed only in 1780, and then it was silent on the question of slavery. But a year later, in 1781, an incident of the sort common to the relationship between enslavers and the enslaved brought matters to a head. Amidst a fierce argument, Mum Bet threw herself between her sister and their angry white mistress, who swung a heated kitchen fire shovel during the dispute. Mum Bet received the blow on her arm. She wrote later, the scar of which I bared to the end of my days. Outraged, she stalked out of the house and refused to return. Her master appealed to the local court to recover his slave. Mum Bet called upon a rising lawyer from nearby Stockbridge to ask if Massachusetts' new constitution, with its preamble stating that, quote, all men are born free and equal, unquote, did not apply to her. Theodore Sedgwick took the case and argued for Mum Bet, argued that she was, quote, entitled to the same privilege as other human beings whose skin was pigmented differently, unquote. The jury agreed, and Mum Bet walked away a free woman, shortly to rename herself Elizabeth Freeman, to punctuate the climax of this case. And it set a precedent. The state's highest court upheld it 2 years later with striking words that ended a century and a half of slavery in Massachusetts. Quote, is not a law of nature that all men are equal and free? Is not the law of nature the law of God? Is not the law of God then against slavery?" Unquote. A hardly noticeable household slave had become an agent of change in New England's most populous state. The daughter of the man who took her freedom suit to court remembered many years later that Mum Bet would say in her old age emphatically, quote, "Any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told that I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it just to stand 1 minute on God's earth a free woman. I would." Unquote. Many enslaved people could not wait for benevolent owners to set them free, wait for legislatures or courts to declare slavery unconstitutional, or hope their master would send them in his place in the army. An unprecedented alternative was now available: flight from slavery to the sheltering arms of an occupying army. Freeing slavery had always been an option in colonial days, and was utilized by a few percent of the males each year and perhaps half as many females. But this was a flight from slavery with the hope of posing successfully as free men or women. And now, for the first time in generations of captivity, there was a chance to flee from slavery toward a force prepared to guarantee freedom to the slave on the run. Before this was possible, only for handfuls of slaves who fled southward from South Carolina and Georgia over miles of unknown terrain to seek sanctuary in Spanish Florida. Now a place of refuge was as close as the British Army. This triggered the greatest slave rebellion in North American history, still widely misunderstood. For example, Hollywood's recent The Patriot gets off to a good start when Benjamin Martin, a British officer, gallops into a South Carolina plantation and offers freedom to any slaves ready to fight with the British. So far, so good, historically speaking. Then the movie, have any of you seen The Patriot? Oh, I guess it didn't do very well. Just as well. But then the movie stands history on its head. British officer says, "I'm here to give you your freedom if you'll come and fight with me." But in the movie, the supposed slaves declared, no, they're not slaves, they're free black workers who work happily for the wages of the white plantation owner. Hollywood murders history again when Occam, a northern slave, shows up on film peering at a proclamation from General Washington in the Continental Congress offering freedom for 1 year of a slave's military service. Well, no, it was the British Army, not the American Army, that issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Here again, the story is still murky. The current understanding is that the British, after deliberating policy choices, decided in late 1775 to offer freedom to slaves fleeing their masters, and then the slaves responded. Cause and effect. But the reverse may be truer. 14 months before Virginia's Lord Dunmore issued his famous proclamation offering freedom to slaves, 14 months before that, right here in Boston, enslaved people offered to take up the sword against their masters. The town was crawling with British soldiers, and Governor General George Gage had dissolved the Massachusetts legislature, thereby foreclosing that avenue to ending slavery. Now slaves move from words to self-assertion. Here is what Abigail Adams wrote her husband, who's in Philadelphia with the Continental Congress. "There has been in town a conspiracy of the Negroes. At present it is kept pretty private and was discovered by one who endeavored to dissuade them from it." Unquote. The slaves, Abigail continued, threatened the man who might reveal their plot with his life, and proceeded, again her words, to draw up a petition to the governor, telling him they would fight for him, provided he would arm them and engage to liberate them if he conquered. For white Bostonians, priding themselves as a different breed from southern slave masters, this came as a shock. Benjamin Franklin's judgment nearly 20 years before, that in his words, every slave may be reckoned a domestic enemy, was now chillingly confirmed. Enslaved Virginians were not far behind Boston slaves in helping to shape British policy rather than simply responding to it. In eastern Virginia, some of them met in November 1774, a year before Dunmore's proclamation, to choose a leader who, in James Madison's words, was to conduct them when the English troops should arrive. Madison wrote that the slaves, in his words, foolishly thought that by returning to the British they should be rewarded with their freedom, unquote. Bad prediction. He soon learned that the slaves were not foolish at all, but were anticipating and promoting what was to become British policy. In early 1775, slaves in Tidewater, Virginia, staged a rash of uprisings, pushing Virginia's governor to capitalize on their boldness. On April 21st, only 2 days after the Minutemen riddled the British troops sent to capture the arsenals at Lexington and Concord, determined slaves in Williamsburg slipped word to Dunmore that they were ready to flee their masters, join him, and take up arms. 10 days later, Dunmore wrote the Secretary of State in London, setting out his plan, quote, to arm all my own Negroes and receive all others that will come to me, whom I shall declare free, unquote. The shot heard round the world at Concord Bridge was the white people's shot. For 500,000 black people, the shot heard through slave cabins came 6 months later, when Dunmore's decision, approved in London, was officially announced. Among the first to flee to Dunmore were 8 of the 27 slaves who toiled at the stately Williamsburg dwelling of Peyton Randolph, Speaker of Virginia's House of Burgesses and one of Virginia's delegates to the Continental Congress, where he would serve as their president for several months. You can go to the Peyton Randolph House in Williamsburg today. Of these 8, 3 were women. If you visit to Williamsburg today, you can learn their names, and now see them pictured as freedom fighters rather than faithless slaves, part of colonial Williamsburg's transformed presentation of the past. Eluding slave patrols, Randolph's slaves reached the British forces not far from town. 3 weeks later, Lund, Washington, manager of his cousin's Mount Vernon estate, warned that among the slaves and indentured servants there, quote, there is not a man of them, but would leave us if they could make their escape, unquote. Lund, Washington captured the mass defection, now beginning in 3 words: liberty is sweet. Perhaps most shocking to slave owners was the flight of enslaved women. For many years, only about 1/8 of slave runaways were female, and that's not surprising since most women had young children or were pregnant or were otherwise tied to black families. But the flight from Randolph's family, 3 women out of 8, prefigured the pattern that prevailed over the next 7 years. Nearly 1/3 of all those claiming liberty under flight to the British were women. Some 800 to 1,000 fled to Dunmore at first, and hundreds more were captured while trying. The slaves of many of Virginia's white revolutionary figures now became black revolutionary Virginians themselves, formed into the British Ethiopian Regiment and outfitted with white sashes bearing the inscription, Liberty to Slaves. Dunmore retreated from Williamsburg to Norfolk with his Ethiopian and British regiments and then boarded warships anchored in Chesapeake Bay. Reaching his forces now became a more difficult matter because fleeing slaves had to commandeer small boats or rafts or canoes and slip down the rivers emptying into the Chesapeake Bay and then getting to the British ships to clamber aboard them. Many took the chance. But stalking these attempts in 1776 at self-liberation was a killer even more dangerous than the white slave patroller. Sweeping eastern North America in 1775-76, smallpox spread rapidly through the crowded British ships, and on Gwynn's Island in Chesapeake Bay, where Dunmore briefly stationed his black and white soldiers that summer. He admitted that smallpox, quote, carried off an incredible number of our people, especially blacks. By July 76, as Congress was declaring independence, he withdrew his disease-riddled forces, sending part to St. Augustine, Florida, and the Bermudas, and others, including 300 of the strongest and healthiest black soldiers, northward for a land assault through Maryland to Pennsylvania, and then to Philadelphia, which the British captured in the fall of 1777. Now, this was the early flight to the British in 1775-76, but it was only the first wave of a much larger attempt at mass self-emancipation by the South's enslaved population. That occurred after the war stalemated in the North, and the British Army decided to move the war south and try and drive a wedge between the upper and lower South. They returned in force, and they struck to conquer the South, where they believed that a black fifth column would provide a decisive edge. This must be accounted as the greatest part of the slave rebellion in the history of England's New World colonies. Black men, women, and children flocked to the invading British Army. Now, we have to think about this. This is 3.5 years after the first attempt to flee to the British had occurred. But they could only flee to the British where the British were. And that was in colonial Williamsburg and then in Norfolk, in just one part of eastern Virginia. But they had to remember how their relatives and friends, had died like diseased sheep when smallpox tore through Dunmore's encampments in 1776. And they knew also how white slave owners had dealt harshly with their kinfolk, the kinfolk of those who had deserted to the British. And they did not know what awaited them if they reached the British lines, whether the British would win the war. This must have gnawed at the thought of many. And yet large numbers took their chances, willing to die free, like Mum Bet, Elizabeth Freeman, if only for a day, a week, or a month, rather than remain enslaved for life. Time permits following the story only for Virginia. I leave aside the cases of Georgia and the Carolinas, though this might appear in if the lectures are published. But as for Virginia, the prospects for slaves changed radically when the British ships began to maneuver up the rivers flowing into the Chesapeake in November of 1780. As the British swept ashore, deep into these rivers, burning houses and barns, slaves now found that the British Army was close at hand. This was the opportunity that enslaved Virginians had been awaiting since Governor Dunmore had fled Williamsburg 4 years before. In January 1781, when Benedict is now fighting for the British, when his squadron stormed up the James River all the way to Richmond, plundering the region, slaves, wrote Dr. Robert Honeyman, quote, flocked to the enemy from all quarters, even from remote parts. Many planters lost 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 slaves. British raids up the Potomac River several months later brought new opportunities to a different region of Virginia. Robert Carter, one of the area's largest planters, lost 30 of his slaves when a British warship landed at his Coal Point plantation. At Washington's Mount Vernon, a British sloop carried off 14 men and 3 women. It was their choice to go with the British. Hundreds of Tidewater planters loaded wagons and headed for the interior with slaves in tow to escape the British forces. General Charles Cornwallis took special delight in making his headquarters at Jefferson's Elk Hill Plantation, not Monticello, but a second plantation in Goochland County, where for 10 days Cornwallis's troops destroyed barns and rustled cattle, sheep, hogs, and horses. When they left, Black Sal, 3 of her children, and 15 other Jefferson slaves went with the British. Another dozen fled his Cumberland County plantation. And when Cornwallis dispatched Tarleton's dragoons to capture Jefferson and the Virginia legislature that had retreated to Charlottesville, Jefferson escaped with his family, but 4 of his Monticello slaves, including old Jenny, probably in her 60s, decamped with the British. Thomas Nelson, Jefferson's successor as governor of Virginia, lost all but 80 to 100 of his 700 slaves, according to a German officer who served with the British. Hessian officer Johann Ewald believed, quote, well over 4,000 Negroes of both sexes and all ages were now a part of Cornwallis's British Army. Virginia's stricken plantation owners like to think that the British compelled their slaves to abandon them. Honeyman, the doctor, wrote, whenever they had an opportunity, the soldiers and inferior officers enticed and flattered the Negroes and prevailed on vast numbers to go along with them, unquote. Richard Henry Lee was indignant that, quote, force, fraud, intrigue, theft have all in turn been employed by the British to delude these unhappy people and to defraud their masters, unquote. But this was not usually the case. Whenever Cornwallis's army approached, slaves could have fled from rather than toward the British. To be sure, many slaves acted under what Sylvia Fry, the historian Sylvia Fry, says, acted under the combined weight of prudence, caution, fear, and realism as the British approached. But those who struck for freedom in the face of heavy odds were hardly deluded. And most, I believe, would have laughed at the notion that they were, quote, defrauding, unquote, their masters. Slaves by the thousand had waited for years for the British Army to hove into sight. Believing that this was their last best chance, they demonstrated an unquenchable thirst for freedom by fleeing to the British just before the military climax at Yorktown in the fall of 1781. But the gamble for freedom in the heart of the Virginia slaveocracy was almost at an end. Decamping from Richmond and moving down the James River, Cornwallis's army reached Williamsburg in late June 1781. After occupying the town briefly, he moved his army on to Jamestown and then in August to the small tobacco port of Yorktown. Formed into shovel brigades, several thousand black refugees built fortifications for Cornwallis's 7,000 troops, preparing to do battle with the French naval forces moving into the Chesapeake Bay and the American land forces gathering to lay siege. Meanwhile, even before they reached Yorktown, hundreds of absconding slaves were struck down by a terrifying attack of smallpox. Within these days past, I have marched by 18 to 20 Negroes that lay dead by the wayside, noted a Connecticut soldier. Others, similarly infected, limped on into Yorktown. In the siege that began at the end of September 1781, hunger became Cornwallis's biggest problem, but disease was not far behind. When animal forage ran out, the British general ordered hundreds of slaves slaughtered and thrown into the York River. Then, with rations dwindling for his troops, he expelled thousands of black auxiliaries from his encampments. The Hessian officer Ewald found this shameful. Quote, we had used them to good advantage and set them free, and now, with fear and trembling, they had to face the reward of their cruel masters, unquote. But perhaps Cornwallis was not quite so merciless as it appears. With surrender imminent, and it was only a few days off, every black man and woman was a hair's breadth away from a certain return to slavery if he kept them in his encampments and surrendered them to the victorious Americans. Forced out of the British fortifications, the black refugees at least had a chance of escaping. General Charles O'Hara, a senior officer in Cornwallis's army, remembered leaving 400 black refugees with provisions to get them through smallpox and placing them, he said, in the most friendly quarter of our neighborhood, where he begged local residents to be kind to the refugees he had once sheltered, unquote. Thus ended the greatest tragedy of the American Revolution for African Americans. Those expelled from the British forces at Yorktown had, in fact, little chance for escape, and even that chance had been severely minimized by the raging smallpox epidemic. The British Southern Campaign, meant to bring the Americans to their knees, marked the height of the greatest slave rebellion in American history. Despite their determination to make themselves free, disease and the outcome of Yorktown put most of the black refugees in shallow graves after only the briefest taste of half-freedom. The minority who escaped and survived the war, perhaps 1 out of 8 who fought in the American Revolution, on the British side or the American side, faced great uncertainty as the war wound down. For those who had fought with the British, the uncertainty was particularly wounding. American diplomats put intense pressure on the British to return all American former slaves to their owners, but this the British refused to do. And that left the question about where the British would take some 10,000 black British subjects. Knowing they could not take them to England's slave-based Caribbean sugar islands, where planters would not tolerate a large number of free blacks, the British painfully decided to transport some 10,000 to Nova Scotia. Here, amidst sparsely scattered old French settlers, remnants of Indian tribes, loyalists from the American colonies, and war-weary British soldiers taking up land, thousands of ex-slaves disembarked from British ships in the winter of 1783 to start life anew. The Book of Negroes, kept exactly by the British in New York, it's kind of a reverse ledger from Ellis Island, the people leaving with the names recorded in detail instead of the people coming in. The names, the ages, the place where they had escaped to the British, the name of their masters, details like this. The Book of Negroes, a fascinating document. And it tells us of the several thousand that left that port in September 1783. Thousands had already left on merchant ships, and others were arriving from Charleston to Nova Scotia. If smallpox and camp fevers had not wiped out thousands of African Americans who joined the British, the evacuation would have been many, many times larger. And Nova Scotia today would have a very, very sizable black population. There are still black towns founded after 1783. Digby, there are many of them that you could find. There would have been many, many more. Nearly 40% of all the evacuees were adult females, and another 25% were children. They came from every American colony, the largest number from Virginia and the Carolinas. Many had toiled for the Patriot founding fathers, and it is very possible that on the stormy voyage to Nova Scotia, the slaves of Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Patrick Henry, and all the others recounted stories of their enslavement and their escape. Of black Americans who survived the war, the vast majority did not leave American shores, but remained to toil where most of them had been born. It fell to them to carry on the dual struggle to end slavery and to create the social networks and the institutional framework of free black life. These were the still largely unappreciated black founding fathers. Here at Harvard, your eminent Bernard Balin has recently given us his appreciation of what he calls the extraordinary generation of white founding fathers. What he calls, quote, one of the most creative groups in modern history, unquote. But just such words can be used to describe the black founding fathers. It is no dishonor to Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, and Adams, who engaged in what Balin calls extraordinary flights of creative imagination, political heresies of the time, utopian fantasies, unquote. The same can be said of the African American leaders who emerged from the shadows after the war. They too, again to borrow Professor Balin's phrases, quote, they too found few precedents to follow, no models to imitate. They too refused to be intimidated, his words again, by the received traditions. And confident of their own integrity and creative capacities, they demanded to know why things must be the way they are. I mean, these words resonate if we're speaking of the African American leaders after the Revolution. It seems to me as much, indeed even more, among those who are white. And they had the imagination and energy, I'm using his words again, but applying them to the black founding fathers, to conceive of something closer to the grain of everyday reality and more likely to lead to human happiness, unquote. Such high praise, I submit, is fitting for the work of the new nation's black leaders, and all the more so because in this 20% of the population, beginning the world anew had to proceed with only rudimentary education, and often even those who lacked the basic necessities of life. Black survivors of the Revolution brought to the task of starting their world anew a whole accumulation of disadvantages and disabilities. Years of unpaid toil, brutal treatment, efforts to keep them illiterate, cruelties that tore at the family fabric, and the disdain of most white people around them. Thus, what they accomplished in the aftermath of revolution is all the more extraordinary, truly unexampled in the Western world of their day. They could not write state constitutions or transform the political system under which white revolutionaries intended to live as an independent people. But the black founding fathers embarked on a project to accomplish what is almost always a part of modern revolutionary agendas, to recast the social system. In the northern states, African Americans and their white abolitionist allies tried to do this by capitalizing on the promise of the revolution's most radical pledge to end slavery. It was through a loosely organized national effort that white people had accomplished independence, but slavery had to be combated state by state, locale by locale, and even person by person. Mostly, this anti-slavery crusade fell to the hands of African Americans who lived in the northern states and were free. Leading them into the new era were a group of mostly young men. It was they who became the rootstock of post-war black society. Revolutions often call forth talent at an unusually young age, but in this case the talent had to emerge from a remnant of young African Americans, because many of those, even most of those in their teens and 20s, had fled to the British during the war or had died during the war. But out of this remnant must come the early black leaders. Harry Hosier, born a slave in North Carolina in about 1750, emerged by the early 1780s as an itinerating Methodist preacher with remarkable gifts. Benjamin Franklin's sober-sided Philadelphia's sober-sided Benjamin Rush called him, quote, the greatest orator in America. Peter Spence, born a slave in Maryland, was 23 when he led black Methodists out of the white church in Wilmington, Delaware in 1806. And Thomas Paul emerged here in Boston as the most important exhorter, preacher, when he was yet in his early 20s. Daniel Coker, a Maryland slave, was only 25 when he became the teacher of a Baltimore black school 2 years after he began preaching at 23. His biting abolitionist pamphlet came off the press before his 26th birthday. Richard Allen began preaching. Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, began preaching to mostly white audiences and converting many of them to Methodism at age 20, only a few months released from slavery. In every seaport town, Boston, Providence, New Haven, New York, Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, young black founding fathers emerged. Most of them who ushered in the first era of freedom were not only mostly self-taught, but widely traveled. In an era of primitive transportation, and when their slender means usually precluded any form of travel other than on foot, many trekked thousands of miles, vast stretches of territory in ways that whites of their age seldom experienced. Richard Allen sojourned for 6 years between South Carolina and New York in his early 20s, and even into Indian country, making a living as woodcutter, shoemaker, and wagon driver while preaching the gospel. Itinerating Methodist preachers Daniel Coker and Harry Hosier knew the entire region, from New York to Baltimore. John Glouster, a 31-year-old Tennessee slave who was to become the first black Presbyterian church minister in Philadelphia, traveled for years up and down the Atlantic seaboard and across the Atlantic to collect money in England to free his family from slavery. Nero Prince, Boston's Nero Prince, successor of Prince Hall here as Grand Master of the city's Black Masonic Lodge, traveled all over the world as a mariner and spent a dozen years as a footman at the court of the Russian Tsar in the early 19th century. Religious leaders such as Lemuel Haynes, John Marant, and John Chavis were likewise knowledgeable about regions as remote as Nova Scotia and the Cherokee towns of central and western Appalachia. In most of these cases, it was conversion to Methodism or the Baptist faith that led them, after securing freedom, to a circuit riding life. It was something akin to biblical journals into the wilderness, here testing their mettle and deepening their faith. In so doing, they developed a toughness, a resiliency, an ability to confront rapidly changing circumstances, a talent for dealing with a wide variety of people. This occurred more rarely among ordinary white citizens of the new republic, most of whom were farm and village bound. These were the African Americans, then, who reached manhood in the crucible of revolution and after the war took up the work called for half a century later, when black leader William Wilson argued we must begin to tell our own story, write our own lecture, paint our own picture, chisel our own bust, and acknowledge and love our own peculiarities. End of quote. I think the time for questions and answers has arrived, and I will continue the story tomorrow at about 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. We have a few minutes here for question and answer, so please feel free to ask Professor Nash any question or comments. Yes, Gwendolyn.
I'm curious about the formerly enslaved African Americans who went with the Loyalists to Nova Scotia that are reported, these people who are reported in the Book of Negroes. When they got there to Nova Scotia, who
shores of Nova Scotia. They're given small amounts of land, few tools, few provisions, and told to go for it, as we say. But they had to go for it under very inhospitable conditions, not the least of which were thousands of British soldiers who mustered out and took up land in Nova Scotia rather than go back to England or serve further in the British Army. By 1791, one of the leaders who had emerged, Thomas Peters, from a formerly North Carolina slave owner, went back to England, hooked up with the English abolitionists, brought back John Clarkson of abolitionist fame, and organized an expedition of 17 ships to carry as many of these new black Nova Scotians back to Mother Africa. And these were the founders of Sierra Leone. Thomas Peters became a black Moses when he comes back across the Atlantic to tell the story on foot, hundreds of miles, going around all the towns to say, be there at Halifax, the fleet will be waiting for you in the spring of '93. And a large majority did decide to go back to Africa. It was Peters who led them ashore in Sierra Leone with the words, the day of Jubilee has come, return ye ransomed sinners home. And the Peters family descendants still live in Sierra Leone today. So it's an extraordinary story. It's been across the Atlantic now 5 times. Ended up going back to a place so many miles where he'd been enslaved a half-century before.
Close.
All right.
Well, we could, okay. No, well, we can just decide who wants to call. Why don't you call on them, and then I'll just get up. No, you call. Laurel, go in.
And she just published her intimate history of Thomas Jefferson. It looked like Hollywood was going to do a movie on Sally Hemings. This is way, way before DNA. It fell through at the last moment because the producers decided the American people weren't ready for it. They weren't ready for the third president of the United States to have a slave mistress and father of children. I think that's why I tried to get the Thomas Peters story told. Even had Brock Peters to play Thomas Peters. Denzel Washington, read the story. He's history-minded and wants to do some history films. But no takers yet. It's just as if we still are wearing short pants, doing short pants history instead of long pants history.
Okay, Wallace.
So it made me think, though, what does account for can we say the same for these revolutionary or era blacks? Can we talk about their ideological origins? seems like when you hear this story, blacks wanting to be free, it's kind of a natural knowledge that freedom is better than slavery. But I'm wondering, is there a way we can suggest there's ideological origins for their desire to be free? Because we know that for the post-revolutionary blacks who are looking back to the revolution and sort of imbibing some of that language for the reasons they wanted to be free. Can we do the same for that era of blacks? And where they get their inspiration to be free?
Well, I think anyone who studies the early period where we have very few documents, very few genuine voices, person voices who speak to us across the ages. This would be whether we're talking of laboring whites, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, or whatever. I think we have to use behavior as a surrogate for ideas put on paper. That we have to infer what they thought from what they did. And I know that's dangerous, but it's about the only way we could develop ideological origins of African American thought. And I think Peter Wood's Black Majority tries to do this for South Carolina slaves in the Stoneman Rebellion, because he didn't have any documents to work with, first-hand documents from a black rebel in the Stoneman Rebellion. But he does try to tell us what he thought was on their mind, and we do know pretty well that they had to make their way to a sanctuary in Catholic Spanish Florida. And that tells us that they knew something about how the Spanish treated slaves differently than the English did. That their chances for getting freedom there were better. And I thought that this petition, I was just shocked by it. I'd read it for so many years, lecturing at UCLA. But I never picked up on this idea that they understood this Spanish rule of cortación, where under Spain it was the right of the slave to have one day a week to work and make money to help buy himself or herself out of freedom, and that a master would lose at court. If the person had the proper purchase price, and the slave had the proper purchase price and the master refused, the court would rule on the side, usually on the side of the slave. That was incredible, but that reached Boston by the 1770s. So, I mean, here, that's part of the black ideological origin of the revolution.
And of course, it's probably on some level, maybe you would suggest they would be aware of these origins in the same way that whites are, the colonists are on some level. If in fact they're not reading the broad sides in the way that maybe the colonists are, who knows, maybe some of them are. So that's part of it as well, imbibing sort of the spirit of the time, I guess.
Well, I think Professor Balin writes brilliantly about this contagion of liberties, he calls it, and all these words that spilled over then entered public discourse, and the idea is it becomes a contagion. But I would argue that the contagion began earlier, but it definitely got pumped up in the 1760s and 70s.
Other questions? Yes.
Certainly within the imagery and the popular imagination of the American Revolution, the picture of an American Army or British Army moving with large numbers of black women and children is not a picture that comes to mind. We have a very masculine picture of what it looks like. And I'm wondering if we have any evidence of what the British soldiers were thinking about the women, and children who were coming, seeking their freedom as well, and what they might have been doing when moving with those Africans.
Well, we know something about what women did in the British Army, and a lot of the men too. They were serving. Almost every British officer had an attendant, and a general would have 3 or 4 personal attendants, and a lieutenant would have 1. So a lot of women did so, and cook and wash clothes and do all of that. There is one marvelous description of Virginia escaped women within the British Army who went out on foraging parties. I had to cut it out because I was mindful of the clock, but it is a very rich description. And I was surprised to read that women would go out on foraging parties where they had to come in with the beef and the corn and everything to feed the British Army. And some of them were raiding their former masters and mistresses' plantations and coming back to the British camps decked out in their mistresses' feathers and their camisoles and their gowns. It was just like a bit of, what do you call this, primitive justice, where you exact your pound of flesh. It's from the Hessian officer Ewald's diary. It's very rich.
Other questions? Well, I have a question. I also know that slaves of the Loyalists go to the Caribbean. And so you have a large number of blacks who after the war, do not go as free people, but go to places like Barbados and really in the Caribbean transform crop production there. I mean, that's the other side of it, that the war dispersed. I think Sylvia Fry is one of the people to make this point, that war dispersed in many ways what we understand as a black diaspora by taking people from the American continent and taking them to Canada, taking them to Sierra Leone, taking them into the Caribbean.
And I don't know very much about it. Isn't there a great book to be written about this? I really didn't mention, but Evelyn brings it up. When the British offered freedom to slaves who had escaped their American masters, I should have qualified it a bit. They were offering freedom for those who escaped masters who were
rebels
on the American side.
Yes.
But they would not offer freedom to slaves who belonged to
Loyalists.
South Carolina Loyalists, Virginia Loyalists, because naturally then they would lose the white Loyalists who were fighting with them too. So
that's that
it's part of the story, and that's where
that's that group.
People you're
Yes.
talking about when the white Loyalists leave, they leave with their slaves and they go to the Caribbean. That's a rich vein to mine.
All right. Well, okay. Yes. Another question.
I just wanted to quickly go back to that Massachusetts petition. I think that's fascinating, the idea of a group of slaves getting together almost as kind of mini committees of correspondence and petitioning the legislature. I just wanted to see if you could say more about how that might have come about in Massachusetts and whether that's unique to Massachusetts or whether it happens in other places somewhat, over the next
word reaching point A from point B. But not so much. It's still in the early stages of time numbers.
Yes.
Wondering in a follow-up to a question, the Somerset case in England had definite repercussions on Massachusetts because both sides of the question were here. The postmaster, I think it was, Stewart, who was the owner of the slave, had been postmaster general here in Massachusetts, and his slave had lived here. So the slave community was very attentive to 1772, and immediately cases get that particular case is used for petitions here within the year, and a few years follow behind. So I think that plays an important part too.
Other questions? Well, thank you very much. And we have